So I think suicide terrorism is interesting as well as important. Those two things don't always go together, but in this case they clearly do. And suicide terrorism is interesting to me partly because it's such an extreme, an outlandish phenomenon, yet when we look at it closely we see that it can be allocated to various parts of life which are really quite ordinary. And so a couple of things come to mind. And one of them is that suicide terrorism is a form of suicide. There are different kinds of suicide, and psychologists who work on suicide normally distinguish determined attempts to kill oneself from what is sometimes called parasuicide, that is, forms of suicidal behaviour that are really cries for help. Namely, you try to kill yourself, but you hope you don't succeed. You hope that somebody will notice and come and help you. Now, when we look at suicide terrorism, it's clearly not a cry for help. It's a determined attempt to destroy oneself and others. So it has to be understood in those terms. But the thing that I think it has in common is the need, first of all, to understand the self. This is something that economists are probably not always very good at. Economists talk very freely about self-interest. It's a commonplace in economic textbooks to find the idea that human behaviour is driven by the desire to maximise one's self-interest or one's personal utility. What's not commonly asked is who is the self whose interest is being maximised? And when we look at the evolution of the person, we see that the self is something that is evolved and is created partly through a series of choices. So I have a self, I'm a middle-aged English academic, I have in my family, in my professional work, in my leisure, I have various selves that have been created partly by accident, but partly also from choices that I've made in my life. And so when I talk about maximising my own self-interest, I can't divorce that from the fact that I am who I am. It's probably going to be very difficult for me then to make choices that destroy my identity as what I've just said, a middle-aged English academic. For example, if I committed an egregious act of fraud, if I abused a child, I would be shamed and disgraced, and I would lose a very important and valuable part of my identity. So one way that social psychologists understand suicide is that the person who commits suicide as a determined attempt has reached a point where they can no longer protect the identity that they have by staying alive. And protecting the identity that they have requires an act of self-destruction. So you could think, for example, of the child who aspires to be a model, but isn't that good looking, right? The child who aspires to be a genius, but actually isn't that clever. These are children who've made choices about the self they want to be that they can't sustain, and they've reached a point where it seems better to destroy their physical existence than to proceed in a way that's incompatible with the self they want to be. When we look at people who commit acts of suicide terrorism, what we see people who've gone on a journey that's invested them with a self that requires self-destruction, because the identity that they've acquired is that of the martyr, the witness to religious truth that can only be validated through death. And indeed, one of the things that we see when we look at the organisation of suicide terrorism is that it's not committed, acts of suicide terrorism are not committed by people who are desperate, it's not committed by people who are in any way particularly unusual psychologically. It's committed by young people who've been trained to see themselves as martyrs to a faith, and having been trained in that way, the only way they can fulfill the self they've chosen is to kill themselves. And we also see that one of the stage that precedes the act of suicide terrorism is an act of commitment. That is, the volunteer is seated in front of a video camera and makes a speech about the act they're going to commit, about the the value that this will create to their religion, and then somebody else takes the video, puts it in an envelope, and puts it in the post. By the time that video arrives at the television station, it's very important to the martyr that the martyr is dead, because otherwise everybody's going to laugh. So what you can see here is, in many ways, quite a cold-blooded process. It requires organisation, requires multiple people working together, and that's why I think acts of suicide terrorism very rarely is people acting on their own. Almost always there's an organisation behind it, there's a procedure, there's a methodology that ends in the commitment of the young person to a course that can only end in death. And so I think the insight of an economist is simply to say, well, yes, this is all about the pursuit of self-interest, with the difference that we have to understand the self that is being manipulated and formed in a way that has to end in self-destruction. I think it starts from the idea that people who engage in acts of terrorism are typically young, very ordinary, I should have said young men, almost always, and often show surprising ignorance about the cause to which they're devoted. So this is a result that comes essentially from people who set out on the course of suicide terrorism and have been intercepted and arrested and interrogated. So there's quite a large volume of evidence now that has come from security services, for example, in Israel. I guess that's probably the most important source, but also in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, where suicide terrorism has been a big problem, and security services have had some success in intercepting and preventing acts of suicide terrorism. So what Abrams says is, to understand suicide terrorism, it's less important to understand the religion. I mean, the religion is there as a mechanism, but it's also important to understand what drives the young person. And often what drives the young person is simply a desire to belong. So when people describe the motivations that led them to join a terrorist faction, the commonest answer is, I joined because my friends joined, or I joined because I liked somebody who was in the faction. In the process of being recruited, they don't actually learn a lot about global politics. They don't learn a lot about the demands of the organisation. They don't learn a lot about political strategy. And in fact, these things are not very important to them, because what they're looking for is some form of social solidarity. And you can get social solidarity in many ways. You can get it from working together in a firm. You can get it from joining a choir or a cycling club or a sports club. But you can also get it, and we know this from lots of examples, you can get it by joining together to commit acts of violence. Sometimes that's football hooliganism. Sometimes it's terrorism. So Abrams's point is that to understand what people are looking for when they join the organisations, it's important to understand the lure of powerful social ties. And again, I think coming back to the perspective of economics, the economists will say, well, these people are maximising some kind of self-interest, which I think is true in probably a rather trivial way, as long as you understand the self, and as long as you understand the needs of the self for solidaristic ties with other young men, and the need to bond with other young men, this time in an organisation that has destructive purposes and will also involve self-destruction.